All right, really quickly, the 4 ways classical musicians don't do their homework. Audiences are smarter than you realize, and they can always tell when a performer has really put forth the time. Number 1, watching and listening to opera. How can I play Weber? I'm a clarinetist. How can I play Weber without watching Der Freischütz? How can I infuse the Mozart concerto with all of its characters, make it invigorating without Don Giovanni? Rossini. I mean, I might be familiar with the orchestral works, and this is most classical musicians are familiar with the orchestral works, but opera is this big hurdle, it seems. And, it's almost like trying to write a Marvel comic without having, or making a Marvel movie without reading the comics. How can you write a Captain America story without knowing the history, knowing the character? It's like the DC failed movie universe that failed because they didn't create origin stories for its characters or really know how those characters' histories were. And, it's also interesting because opera is like movies. A lot of times when I'm teaching, I try to bring up movie references to just bring some level of drama into students playing. And opera is such a much more pure version of that, and it's actually the original composers. There's such a level of in terms of watching opera today, it's never been easier. Not only with the internet, but like the Met Live HD. That's a real experience there, even for a total beginner at opera. There's so much that the producers have taken to make it accessible and interesting to watch. So that's number 1. Number 2, listening to the great recordings of your instrument. Never have recordings been more accessible. On any internet device, you can basically stream Spotify on a toaster oven or a thermostat these days. And yet I find my students listen to great recordings so much less than I did when I was in high school. They'll put into YouTube and they'll watch the first couple of videos, but they're really great recordings. And I'm not even talking about digging deep and finding rare recordings of their teachers or really finding a large tapestry of how schools of sound. No, I'm just talking about the major recordings of their instrument, and there has to be some level of homage to it. Again, going back to movies, it's like making a crime movie today without at least some reference to The Godfather, or making some space sci-fi fantasy movie without at least some tertiary glance to Star Wars or Star Trek. You have to recognize, and there has to be a level of homage, but also the great recordings are great recordings for a reason. And I can't tell you how many times I hear clarinetists that clearly have not heard the great Robert Marcellus or Harold Wright recordings of Mozart, and really studied them and really sought to, on some level, emulate them. One thing I do as a instrumentalist is I can do impressions of different players. I can really capture the essence of some of my favorite players and do even just like a caricature of them, but by doing so it gives me more stylistic freedom, and it means I can draw upon my inspirations that much more readily and freely. And then I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel. I do it in a very genuine, or I try to do it in a very genuine way of paying homage to my inspirations. All right, number 3, knowing your tools. This is probably the most divisive topic because so many musicians, I'll go back to superheroes. We assume that so many classical musicians are like Superman. They are just that gifted and have that much strength and that much mental prowess, dexterity, that they just make anything work. And I think there's this myth that in music education, the really great players make things work. Yes, some of them do. Yes, some of them do. But you know how many people I see majoring in music, pursuing music because they're really great at making things work, at forcing the instrument to do what they want. Most of the greatest players I've heard, they don't make it work. They have the instrument work for them. So they can devote that much more mental energy to the music, to the audience, to a good interpretation, to that rich history I was talking about, step 1 and 2. To the point where I see a lot of teachers shaming their students for trying new things. Now, on one hand, you have principal players who can't change anything because they're locked in. You know, you'll hear some players sound the same for decades because they have to have that level of consistency. They have to produce or they'll get fired. And that is that's a whole other video on how to achieve that level of consistency. But the thing is, when you get a job, Russell Harlow wrote about this when he tried Harold Wright's clarinet setup. It took him years to try and change because he had a job and he had to produce. So while you don't have a job, it's the perfect time to experiment. Now, that obviously can't take up, you still have to put forth practice time, steps 1 and 2, but also your mechanics of playing, your technique, other hours listening, other music studies. But this is where I differ, because really understanding the tools and the variables is a chore. It is compulsory. It's a responsibility of the player. Do you know how many clarinetists I talk to, even top players, and they say, well, I just really don't know how to really work reeds. My reed game is not what it could be. And that's incredible. It's like a professional race car driver that doesn't know tires, professional golfer that doesn't know sizes, driver sizes. So like, again, where I differ is it is a responsibility, and I do it very dispassionately. I delve straight into it mostly because I can afford a level of inconsistency, because I don't have a concert every single day. I don't have a gig every single day. And I can learn more about it. I can delve more into it. But I'm very dispassionate. If I've my 15 golden era Shedvells, I'll A-B them. I'll have people listen very, very methodically, very mechanically, very dispassionately. It's absolutely a responsibility. And especially if you're a teacher, you have to know how these variables affect things, because understanding this will help explain how a student can practice and practice and practice and practice and still not have the performances they want. This is a variable. Absolutely. It's a set of variables. And I see so many teachers that have no literacy of understanding how, in minute detail, how equipment can really affect the long-term pedagogical progress of some of their students. And it's almost like chaos theory in terms of a butterfly coughs. Well, you change one thing, multiply it over years. We take that for granted as teachers, and as classical musicians. We use what works and we don't think about it. But there's so much that we don't know when we do that. There's so many unknowns. And another huge example of this, let's go back to step 2, your inspirations, the great recordings. You know, playing on what they played sometimes can be really eye-opening. Suddenly, they're a peer. They're not up on a pedestal. Suddenly, they're just, you understand much more intuitively, much more intrinsically how they did what they did. And I'm not saying that they aren't great. Of course, they're still the grace of the instrument, but you can understand partially why they made some of the choices they made, why they were able to achieve what they were able to achieve, at least a small part of it. I remember having played some of Harold Wright's reeds and some of his horns. So much of it was built in, and this is not to take anything away from the greatness that was the great Harold Wright, but he was Batman. He had the right tools. And lastly, step 4, imagination. Imagination, I feel, can only happen in classical music with steps 1 through 3, as well as command over notes and rhythms, as well as technique practice and control over all of your mechanics. I listened back to some recordings I made in high school, and it's very hard for musicians to do that. And they're not great, they're not even good. There's rhythmic errors, there's mistakes, but there's something invigorating about some of the recordings I made in high school. There's something that's full of life, full of energy, and it's the fact that I had imagination. I had a vision for how I wanted these pieces to sound, and it's because I've listened to opera ever since I was a kid. I've listened to the great recordings. I used to listen to the Marcellus Mozart every single night before I went to sleep, and the great Harold Wright recordings, and so many others, and obviously great recordings that aren't clarinet players, but listening a lot and finding, eventually you become a connoisseur of the great recordings, almost like a food critic, and that absolutely enriches you. To quote the great Michael Brecker, he said, if you want to be my equal, don't listen to me, listen to who I listen to. And step 3, I had a great teacher. He helped me find really great equipment for the time, for a high schooler. But even then, I was experimenting all the time with reeds, all the time, and even ligatures. And once again, I see so many teachers shaming their students into messing around. And if they're not putting forth the time, if they're not doing every other requirement of what they need to be doing to get good, if they're not putting forth the work, if they're looking at it as gear acquisition syndrome as a way to leapfrog some of the steps to get better, then yes, they should be scolded for wasting their time. But if you're doing every other responsibility for improvement, then understanding your tools and trying things and learning from the equipment is compulsory, and it's just going to get you that level higher. You know, this is especially true when I listen to classical saxophonists, because most classical saxophonists compared to classical clarinetists don't know how to work on reeds. I can always tell when a really great performer is just playing a reed that is just not working. It's like watching a great driver, drive a Lamborghini with golf cart tires. It's disappointing, and it's frustrating also. And the audiences somewhere deep down can tell